Number 1. Jerry Sandusky. Jerry Sandusky was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was a trusted insider, a respected figure inside one of the most powerful college football programs in the United States. For decades, he stood on the sidelines of Penn State University as an assistant football coach, celebrated for his defensive schemes, and praised for his work with children through a charity called the Second Mile. To the public, Sandusky was a mentor, a role model, and a man devoted to helping vulnerable youth. Behind that image was a long-running pattern of abuse that lasted more than 15 years. Sandusky joined Penn State's football staff in 1969 and eventually became defensive coordinator under legendary head coach Joe Paterno. He helped build Penn State into a national powerhouse, earning 2 national championships and a reputation for discipline, integrity, and success. When Sandusky retired from coaching in 1999, he did not disappear. Instead, he remained deeply connected to the program, retaining office access, locker room privileges, and continued involvement with players and staff. At the same time, Sandusky was heavily involved with the Second Mile, a charity he founded in 1977 that worked with at-risk boys. The organization gave him constant access to children from unstable backgrounds, many of whom lacked strong parental supervision. According to prosecutors, this access became the foundation of his crimes. Sandusky used grooming tactics that followed a clear pattern. He built trust with children and their families, offering mentorship, gifts, trips, and affection. He took boys to football games, brought them into Penn State facilities, and invited them to his home. Over time, boundaries were slowly crossed. What began as wrestling or showering together escalated into repeated sexual assaults. The abuse occurred in multiple locations, including Sandusky's home, hotels, locker rooms, and most notoriously, the Penn State football facilities themselves. Several victims later testified that they were assaulted in the showers of the football building, sometimes in plain view of others who either did not understand what they were seeing or chose not to intervene. The scandal began to unravel publicly in 2011, but warning signs had existed for years. In 1998, a mother reported to campus police that Sandusky had showered with her son and behaved inappropriately. An investigation was opened, but quietly closed without charges. Sandusky was questioned, but faced no consequences. Instead of being removed from contact with children, he continued his involvement with the Second Mile and retained access to Penn State facilities. In 2001, a graduate assistant named Mike McQuarrie witnessed Sandusky sexually assaulting a boy in the locker room showers. McQuarrie reported what he saw to head coach Joe Paterno, who then passed the information up the chain to university administrators. Those administrators did not report the incident to law enforcement. No immediate action was taken to protect children. Sandusky remained free. For another decade, the abuse continued. In November 2011, after a lengthy grand jury investigation, Jerry Sandusky was arrested and charged with 40 counts of child sexual abuse involving multiple victims. The charges sent shockwaves through the sports world and beyond. As details emerged, it became clear that this was not only a case about one man, but about an entire system that failed repeatedly. In June 2012, Sandusky went to trial. Over several weeks, the jury heard testimony from victims who described years of abuse, manipulation, and trauma. Many of them were visibly emotional on the stand, recounting how Sandusky exploited their trust and innocence. Prosecutors laid out a pattern of predatory behavior spanning more than 15 years and involving at least 10 boys. Sandusky took the stand in his own defense, denying the allegations and portraying his behavior as misunderstood horseplay. The jury did not believe him. On June 22, 2012, Jerry Sandusky was convicted on 45 counts of sexual abuse. He was acquitted on only 3 lesser charges. The verdict marked one of the most significant convictions of a serial child abuser in U.S. history. On October 9, 2012, Sandusky was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in state prison. Given his age, the sentence effectively ensured he would die behind bars. But the consequences did not stop with Sandusky. The fallout engulfed Penn State University. Head coach Joe Paterno, who had built a legacy over 46 years, was fired just days after Sandusky's arrest. University President Graham Spanier was removed. Athletic Director Tim Curley and Vice President Gary Schultz were charged for failing to report abuse. Paterno died in January 2012, before the trial concluded, leaving his legacy permanently divided. In July 2012, the NCAA issued unprecedented sanctions against Penn State. The football program was fined $60 million, banned from bowl games for 4 years, stripped of scholarships, and had 111 wins vacated. The punishment was meant not only to penalize the institution, but to send a message about accountability and child protection. Beyond legal penalties, the Sandusky case became a national reckoning. It exposed how power, reputation, and institutional loyalty can override basic moral responsibility. It showed how respected organizations can fail catastrophically when protecting their image becomes more important than protecting children. For the victims, the damage was permanent. Many described lifelong trauma, broken trust, and years of silence fueled by fear and shame. Civil lawsuits resulted in Penn State paying hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements. Jerry Sandusky now resides in a Pennsylvania state prison, serving a sentence that reflects the scale of his crimes. His name is permanently associated with one of the darkest chapters in American sports history. This was not just the story of a predator. It was the story of what happens when warnings are ignored, when authority goes unquestioned, and when institutions choose self-preservation over human life. Number 2, Darun Ravi. Darun Ravi was not violent. He did not physically touch anyone. He did not push anyone off a bridge. And yet, his actions became inseparably linked to one of the most high-profile student deaths in modern American history. This case is not about murder. It is about power, humiliation, technology, and consequence. In September 2010, Darun Ravi was an 18-year-old freshman at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He came from an affluent background, was academically successful, and had no criminal history. Ravi was assigned a dorm room in Davidson Hall with another freshman, 18-year-old Tyler Clementi. Tyler Clementi was a talented violinist, quiet, introverted, and recently out as gay to a few close friends. He was still navigating his identity in a new environment. The two roommates barely knew each other, but tensions formed quickly. Ravi later complained to friends that he felt uncomfortable sharing a room with a gay roommate. That discomfort turned into resentment. Resentment turned into mockery, and mockery turned into deliberate invasion. On September 19, 2010, Ravi secretly activated his webcam while Tyler was in the dorm room with another man. Ravi was not in the room at the time. Using a chat program, he remotely accessed the camera and watched Tyler kissing his guest. He then texted friends about what he had seen. Instead of stopping there, Ravi escalated. He tweeted publicly that he had seen his roommate making out with a dude, inviting others to watch a planned second encounter. The tweet was seen by dozens of people. Screenshots spread quickly. What had been a private moment was now a public spectacle. 2 days later, Ravi attempted to repeat the surveillance, again activating the webcam remotely. Although technical issues prevented a full live stream, the intent was clear. Tyler Clementi became aware that his privacy had been violated. He messaged Ravi, asking if he could have the room to himself. Ravi agreed, but the damage was already done. Clementi did not report the incident to university officials in a meaningful way. He confided in friends. He posted cryptic messages online. One of his final Facebook posts read, "Jumping off the GW Bridge, sorry." On September 22nd, 2010, Tyler Clementi jumped from the George Washington Bridge into the Hudson River. His body was recovered days later. The country reacted immediately. Within hours, the story exploded across national media. Headlines framed Clementi's death as a result of cyberbullying and homophobia. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups pointed to a broader pattern of harassment faced by gay youth. Universities across the country were forced to confront how technology could be weaponized inside dorm rooms. Law enforcement quickly turned its attention to Darun Ravi. Ravi was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including invasion of privacy, bias intimidation, witness tampering, and hindering apprehension. Importantly, he was not charged with causing Clementi's death. There was no statute allowing for that. The case instead focused on Ravi's actions leading up to it. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered text messages, tweets, and chat logs that showed Ravi joking about the surveillance, minimizing its seriousness, and attempting to delete evidence after Clementi's death. These digital footprints became central to the case. Ravi's defense argued that he was immature, not malicious, that he never intended harm, that he had no idea Clementi would take his own life. They emphasized that Ravi had no history of violence or hatred, and that the situation had spiraled beyond what he could have imagined. The prosecution countered that intent did not require foresight of suicide. What mattered was deliberate invasion, public humiliation, and bias-driven behavior. They argued Ravi's actions were not accidental. They were planned, repeated, and shared for entertainment. In March 2012, a jury found Darun Ravi guilty on 15 counts, including invasion of privacy and bias intimidation. The verdict was controversial. Some believed it was just. Others argued the charges were excessive and driven by public outrage rather than legal proportionality. At sentencing, the judge faced enormous pressure. Advocates demanded prison time to send a message about cyberbullying. Others warned against turning a reckless teenager into a scapegoat for a national tragedy. Ravi addressed the court and apologized, saying he was deeply remorseful and never intended harm. In May 2012, Darun Ravi was sentenced to 30 days in jail, 3 years of probation, mandatory counseling, community service, and a fine. The sentence was far below the maximum possible. Ravi served 20 days before being released early for good behavior. But the legal consequences did not end there. Because Ravi was not a U.S. citizen, the conviction triggered deportation proceedings. For years, he fought removal from the country. In 2016, New Jersey's governor vacated Ravi's conviction after he completed a pretrial intervention program, clearing his criminal record. In 2017, the charges were formally dismissed. Legally, the case ended. Culturally, it did not. Tyler Clementi's death became a symbol. Universities implemented new policies on cyber harassment. States reviewed privacy laws involving digital surveillance. Schools expanded LGBTQ+ support systems. The phrase cyberbullying kills became part of public discourse. The case also raised uncomfortable questions. Where does responsibility begin and end? Can humiliation be as damaging as physical harm? Should the law punish intent or outcome? Darun Ravi did not commit murder, but his actions demonstrated how modern tools can destroy someone without a single act of physical violence. A webcam, a tweet, a joke shared at the wrong time. Tyler Clementi never had the chance to grow beyond that moment. This case remains one of the clearest examples of how technology removes distance from harm, and how a single decision made for amusement can trigger irreversible consequences. Number 3. Joran van der Sloot. Joran van der Sloot was already infamous before he ever killed Stephanie Flores. By 2010, his name had been attached to one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances of the 21st century, Natalee Holloway, an 18-year-old American who vanished during a graduation trip to Aruba in May 2005. Vandersloot was the last known person seen with her. He was detained, questioned, released, and never charged. But suspicion never left him. 5 years later, on the exact anniversary of Holloway's disappearance, Joran Vandersloot committed a murder that could not be explained away. Joran Vandersloot was born in 1987 in the Netherlands and raised partly in Aruba, where his father worked as a lawyer and judge. He grew up privileged, multilingual, and well-connected. When Natalee Holloway disappeared on May 30th, 2005, Vandersloot quickly became the central focus of the investigation. He admitted spending the night with her, but claimed he dropped her off at her hotel. That story changed repeatedly. Over the years, Vandersloot gave multiple contradictory accounts of what happened to Natalee Holloway. He implicated friends, suggested she had overdosed, claimed she was abducted by others, and later said she died accidentally. Each version collapsed under scrutiny. No body was ever found. The case stalled, but the public never forgot his face. By 2010, Vandersloot was a known figure internationally. His name carried weight, suspicion, and notoriety. He was also deeply in debt from gambling, moving between countries and evading responsibility. On May 30th, 2010, in Lima, Peru, Joran Vandersloot met 21-year-old Stephanie Flores Ramirez inside the Miraflores district's Hotel TAC. Flores was a successful business student and daughter of a prominent Peruvian businessman. The two met at a casino earlier that night. They drank, talked, and returned to Vandersloot's hotel room. What happened next was not spontaneous. According to Vandersloot's own confession, Flores discovered his laptop open and recognized his name. She had seen the Natalee Holloway case online. She confronted him. She asked questions. She realized who he was. That moment sealed her fate. Vandersloot later admitted that he became enraged. He claimed he feared she would expose him, scream, or alert authorities. He attacked her, beating her and strangling her inside the hotel room. Flores died on the floor. Vandersloot did not call for help. Instead, he fled. He left Peru and crossed into Chile, attempting to disappear once again. But this time, there was no mystery. Hotel surveillance, forensic evidence, and witness accounts made the case airtight. Interpol issued a notice. Chilean authorities arrested him just days later. When confronted with the evidence, Vandersloot confessed. In January 2012, he was convicted in Peru of first-degree murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Unlike the Holloway case, there was no ambiguity, no missing evidence, and no room for narrative manipulation. This was a controlled environment with a body, a confession, and proof. For many observers, the conviction felt like delayed justice. But the story did not end there. While serving his sentence, Vandersloot remained relevant to the Natalee Holloway case. In 2010, shortly after killing Flores but before his arrest, he attempted to extort Holloway's family. He promised to reveal the location of Natalee's remains in exchange for money. The information he provided was false. The family paid anyway, desperate for closure. In 2023, nearly 2 decades after Natalee Holloway vanished, Vandersloot was extradited to the United States to face extortion charges. This time, there was no denial. He pleaded guilty. In a U.S. courtroom, Joran Vandersloot finally admitted what many had believed since 2005. He confessed to killing Natalee Holloway. According to his statement, he struck her on the beach after she rejected his advances, then disposed of her body in the ocean. The confession did not lead to a murder charge. There was no body. No physical evidence remained. But legally, it closed a chapter that had haunted the Holloway family for 18 years. 2 women, 2 countries, 2 outcomes. Stephanie Flores received justice through a conviction and sentence. Natalie Holloway received the truth, far too late. Joran van der Sloot is now serving sentences in both Peru and the United States. His name is no longer tied to speculation, but to confirmed violence. What once looked like arrogance and manipulation revealed itself as something more dangerous, a pattern of entitlement, rage, and control. This case exposes a critical reality. When early warning signs are ignored, when manipulation is mistaken for charm, and when privilege shields accountability, consequences do not disappear. They compound. Van der Sloot avoided justice once. He did not avoid it twice. Number 4. Mziwa Madota, Kwabe. Mziwa Madota Kwabe was not the mastermind, not the husband, and not the face splashed across international tabloids, but he was the man who helped turn a luxury honeymoon into a staged execution. On November 13, 2010, 28-year-old Annie Dewani, a Swedish-born woman of Indian descent, arrived in Cape Town, South Africa, with her new husband, British millionaire Shani Dewani, to celebrate their honeymoon. The trip was meant to be the beginning of a new life, filled with sightseeing, wine tours, and 5-star hotels. Instead, within days, Annie would be dead, shot through the neck and left in the back seat of a taxi, while the case spiraled into one of the most disturbing and controversial murder-for-hire investigations of the decade. On the night of November 13th, the couple hired a taxi driven by Zola Tongo, who in turn contacted Mziwa Madota Kwabe and Zolile Mangeni. What appeared to be a random carjacking quickly unraveled as something far more calculated. The taxi was deliberately diverted to a township area where Kwabe and Mangeni entered the vehicle. Shani Dewani was forced out of the car and told to lie face down on the road, while Annie was taken away in the back seat. Minutes later, she was shot and killed. The abandoned taxi was found not far away, with Annie's body still inside. Initially, the story presented to police was simple and tragic. A honeymooning couple caught in the crossfire of violent crime in South Africa. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Phone records showed extensive communication between the taxi driver and the attackers before the incident. Surveillance footage contradicted timelines. Witness statements did not align. Within days, police arrested Zola Tongo, who soon cracked under pressure. Tongo admitted the carjacking was staged and that he had been hired to arrange the killing. He named Mziwa Madota Kwabe and Zolile Mangeni as the men who carried out the attack and claimed that Shani Dewani himself had ordered his wife's murder. According to Tongo, Dewani paid for the hit, motivated by a desire to escape his marriage and conceal his sexual orientation, a claim that would dominate headlines and divide public opinion. Kwabe was arrested shortly after and initially denied involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. Phone logs placed him in constant contact with Tongo. Witnesses placed him at the scene. Ballistics linked the weapon used by Mangeni to the killing. Facing a potential life sentence and seeing the case collapsing around him, Kwabe made a strategic decision. In 2012, he pleaded guilty to murder, robbery with aggravating circumstances, and kidnapping. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Shani Dewani and other co-conspirators. In his testimony, Kwabe described how the plot was explained to him as a simple job, how money was promised, and how the intention was always to kill Annie, not merely scare or rob the couple. He admitted knowing the outcome in advance and participating anyway. The court sentenced Kwabe to 25 years in prison. Zolile Mangeni, identified as the shooter, was also convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he later died in prison from a brain tumor in 2014. Zola Tongo received an 18-year sentence after cooperating with prosecutors. But the central question remained unresolved for years. Was Shani Dewani truly the mastermind, or was he a convenient villain shaped by public suspicion and circumstantial evidence. Dewani was extradited to South Africa in 2014 after a lengthy legal battle in the United Kingdom, where his defense argued he was mentally unfit to stand trial. His case became a media spectacle, dissected endlessly by tabloids, documentaries, and armchair detectives. In 2014, after a high-profile trial, Shani Dewani was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The judge ruled that while the prosecution's theory was plausible, it was not proven beyond reasonable doubt, and that key witnesses, including Kwabe, were unreliable and motivated by reduced sentences. The verdict shocked many and outraged Annie's family, who believed justice had not been served. For Mziwamadoda Kwabe, however, the outcome of Dewani's trial did not change his fate. His guilty plea locked him into a quarter-century sentence, a stark reminder that even hired hands in a murder-for-hire scheme are not shielded by distance from the victim. Kwabe's role demonstrated how economic desperation, opportunism, and moral detachment can converge in deadly ways. He was not driven by personal hatred toward Annie Dewani. He did not know her. He was driven by money and the belief that the crime would be blamed on random violence, a common narrative in a country grappling with high crime rates. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Annie Dewani case became a global headline not only because of its brutality, but because it shattered the illusion of coincidence. It exposed how easily criminal networks can exploit stereotypes, how quickly narratives can be manipulated, and how justice can hinge on testimony from men already steeped in crime. It also highlighted the uncomfortable reality that in contract killings, the truth is often fragmented, traded, and reshaped by those seeking survival. Annie Dewani was 28 years old. She had been married for less than 2 weeks. Her life ended not because of a random act, but because of a planned decision carried out by people willing to treat murder as a transaction. Mziwamadoda Kwabe now serves his sentence in a South African prison, his name permanently tied to a crime that crossed borders and captivated the world. The case remains a grim lesson in how quickly love can be weaponized, how trust can be exploited, and how a single decision to accept money can place someone forever on the wrong side of history. Say next when you're ready for Case 5, Dickie E. Anderson Jr. Next, number 5, Dickie E. Anderson Jr. Dickie E. Anderson Jr. was not a stranger to chaos, but the events of July 2009 marked the point where a volatile personal relationship crossed into irreversible violence. This case did not involve fame, national headlines, or institutional cover-ups. It was a blunt example of how domestic conflict, when combined with control, anger, and access to a weapon, can end in permanent loss. In Escambia County, Florida, 33-year-old Michelle Morris lost her life during a confrontation with Anderson, a man she knew and trusted. What followed was a methodical investigation, a clear evidentiary trail, and a sentence that ensured Anderson would never walk free again. Michelle Morris was described by friends and family as independent and resilient, but like many victims of domestic violence, much of what she endured happened behind closed doors. Her relationship with Dickie Anderson was unstable and marked by escalating arguments. Witnesses later described frequent disputes, jealousy, and threats that were dismissed at the time as just another fight. That normalization of volatility would prove fatal. On the day of the killing, the two were involved in an intense argument at a residence in Escambia County. The conflict was not sudden or accidental. According to prosecutors, it followed a pattern of unresolved disputes that had intensified over time. During the argument, Anderson retrieved a firearm. The presence of a gun immediately shifted the situation from volatile to deadly. He shot Michelle Morris, killing her at the scene. There was no evidence of self-defense, no sign of a struggle that justified lethal force, and no indication that the shooting was accidental. The act was deliberate, final, and irreversible. Law enforcement responded quickly. Anderson was taken into custody, and investigators secured the scene. Physical evidence, witness statements, and ballistic analysis left little room for ambiguity. The firearm used in the killing was recovered. The trajectory of the shot was consistent with intentional discharge. Neighbors and acquaintances confirmed that the relationship had been troubled and that arguments were frequent. The prosecution framed the case not as a sudden loss of control, but as the predictable outcome of an abusive dynamic that had gone unchecked. During the trial, the state emphasized that domestic violence rarely begins with homicide. It begins with intimidation, control, verbal abuse, and escalation. By the time a weapon is introduced, the danger is already extreme. The defense attempted to portray the incident as a heated argument that spiraled out of control, but the jury was not persuaded. There was no credible evidence to support a lesser charge, and Anderson's actions after the shooting did not suggest panic or remorse consistent with an accident. In 2012, Dickie E. Anderson Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and Florida's firm stance on intentional domestic homicide. For the court, this was not a case of momentary rage deserving leniency. It was the culmination of a dangerous relationship that ended exactly how domestic violence experts warn it can. Michelle Morris became one of many women whose deaths are later described as preventable in hindsight. Friends recalled warning signs, arguments that felt excessive, behavior that felt controlling, incidents that were never formally reported because they seemed survivable at the time. The case became part of a broader pattern in the Pensacola area, where multiple domestic violence homicides during that period forced local authorities and advocacy groups to confront gaps in prevention, reporting, and intervention. Prosecutors used the case to emphasize a critical point to the jury and the public. Domestic disputes are not private matters when violence is present. They are high-risk situations with predictable outcomes. When threats escalate and weapons are accessible, the probability of lethal violence increases sharply. Anderson's conviction closed the legal chapter, but it did not restore what was lost. Michelle Morris did not get a second chance to leave, to rebuild, or to be protected by the systems that often intervene too late. Her death reinforced a reality that courts see repeatedly. The most dangerous place for many victims is not a dark alley or a random encounter, but a familiar environment shared with someone they know. Dickie E. Anderson Jr. now spends his life in a Florida prison, removed permanently from society. His sentence serves no rehabilitative purpose. It exists solely to protect others and to acknowledge the irreversible harm caused by his actions. This case never became a national headline, but its lesson is as severe as any mass tragedy. Violence does not need spectacle to be lethal. It only needs proximity, access, and the absence of intervention. In Escambia County, one argument crossed that line, and the consequences were permanent. Number 6, James Holmes. James Holmes did not snap, lose control, or act on sudden rage. What happened on July 20th, 2012, in Aurora, Colorado, was the result of deliberate planning, calculated preparation, and a conscious decision to carry out mass violence in a crowded public space. Holmes was a 24-year-old neuroscience PhD student at the University of Colorado, Denver, described by classmates as quiet, intelligent, and socially withdrawn. On the surface, he appeared unremarkable, but beneath that exterior was a deteriorating mental state that he failed to disclose in any way that triggered intervention before it was too late. In the months leading up to the attack, Holmes withdrew from his doctoral program, stockpiled weapons and ammunition, and methodically prepared for what would become one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. He legally purchased 4 firearms, including an AR-15 style rifle, a shotgun, and 2 handguns, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition. He also booby-trapped his apartment with improvised explosive devices designed to kill or seriously injure first responders, wiring his residence with gasoline, explosives, and trip mechanisms. This was not impulsive behavior. It was structured, intentional, and sustained over time. On the night of July 20th, Holmes drove to the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora during a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises, a packed showing filled with families, teenagers, and fans. He parked his car strategically near an exit, entered the theater, exited briefly, and then returned wearing tactical gear, a ballistic vest, helmet, and a gas mask. He released smoke grenades into the crowd and opened fire indiscriminately. The chaos was immediate. People initially believed it was part of the movie. Within seconds, reality became unmistakable. Holmes fired into the audience repeatedly, reloading and switching weapons as people attempted to flee. 12 people were killed and 70 were wounded, 58 of them by gunfire. Victims were struck at random, many while trying to shield loved ones or escape the confined space. The attack ended not because Holmes was stopped by force, but because he calmly exited the theater, walked to his car, and waited for police. He surrendered without resistance, informing officers that his apartment was rigged to explode. Bomb squads later spent hours dismantling the explosives, confirming that the devices were real and capable of causing mass casualties. Holmes was arrested and charged with 166 counts, including multiple counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder. The scale of the charges reflected the scope of the harm. During the legal proceedings, the case became a focal point for debates about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and public safety. Holmes's defense team argued that he was legally insane at the time of the attack, citing diagnoses of schizophrenia spectrum disorders and claiming he was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Prosecutors countered that despite his mental health issues, Holmes demonstrated clear awareness, planning, and understanding of his actions. They emphasized his efforts to avoid detection, his strategic choices, and his detailed preparation as evidence of legal sanity. The trial was lengthy and emotionally exhausting. Survivors and families of victims testified about the lasting physical and psychological damage caused by the shooting. Jurors were presented with notebooks Holmes had mailed to his psychiatrist containing disturbing drawings and writings, which were never opened before the attack due to procedural delays, a failure that would later be heavily scrutinized. In 2015, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found James Holmes guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, jurors could not unanimously agree on the death penalty, resulting in a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Holmes was formally sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 3,318 years, a symbolic figure representing the maximum penalty for each attempted murder count. The sentence ensured that Holmes would never be released and would never again pose a threat to the public. The Aurora shooting left permanent scars. Survivors live with paralysis, chronic pain, and trauma. Families lost children, parents, and partners in a place meant for entertainment, not fear. The case forced institutions to examine failures at multiple levels, including gaps in mental health intervention, the ease of acquiring weapons, and the lack of mechanisms to act on warning signs that did exist but were not fully recognized or acted upon in time. Unlike some mass violence cases where motive remains unclear, Holmes himself stated that he sought notoriety and control, believing the act would give his life meaning. That belief collapsed under the weight of reality. He did not become powerful or significant. He became a permanent example of how methodical planning combined with untreated mental deterioration can produce catastrophic outcomes when no effective interruption occurs. James Holmes now lives in a Colorado supermax prison, isolated and forgotten, his name mentioned only in the context of a tragedy that reshaped conversations about public safety and accountability. The Aurora Theater Massacre was not an accident of fate. It was the end result of a sequence of decisions made over months, each one narrowing the path until violence became inevitable. Number 7. The Jessica Ridgway Case. On the morning of October 5, 2012, 10-year-old Jessica Ridgway left her home in Westminster, Colorado, and began her usual walk to school, a short route she had taken before, without incident, but she never arrived, triggering a rapid response from her family and local authorities that quickly expanded into a large-scale search effort across the community. Jessica was described as quiet, polite, and trusting, a child who followed routines and posed no risk factors that would normally raise concern, which made her sudden disappearance especially alarming. Witnesses later confirmed seeing her walking along the sidewalk shortly after 8 a.m., after which she vanished. Law enforcement immediately treated the case as high priority, deploying search teams, canvassing neighborhoods, and issuing alerts while volunteers joined in organized efforts to locate her. The case drew intense media attention, placing pressure on investigators to move quickly as days passed with no confirmed sightings. On October 10th, hikers discovered partial remains in an Arvada park, confirming that Jessica had been harmed and shifting the investigation into a homicide case. Forensic testing identified the remains as Jessica Ridgway, prompting a renewed focus on individuals living near her walking route and anyone with suspicious behavior during the time frame. Investigators began reviewing surveillance footage, phone records, and prior reports of attempted assaults in the area. The breakthrough came when Austin Sigg, a 17-year-old who lived nearby, confessed to his mother. Rather than conceal the information, she contacted police, leading to a search of their home where additional evidence was recovered, corroborating Sigg's confession. Sigg admitted to abducting Jessica and taking her to his home, where she later died. He also confessed to an earlier attempted abduction of a jogger several months prior, an incident that had been reported but remained unsolved at the time. Prosecutors later emphasized that this earlier incident represented a missed opportunity for intervention, as Sigg's behavior followed a documented escalation pattern that experts recognize in violent offenders. Sigg was arrested without resistance and cooperated fully with investigators, providing detailed statements that removed ambiguity from the case. Because he was a minor at the time of the crime, the legal process involved extensive evaluation regarding whether he should be tried as an adult, ultimately resulting in adult charges due to the seriousness of the offense. In November 2013, Sigg pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including first-degree murder and kidnapping, avoiding a trial. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 86 years, a sentence designed to ensure long-term incarceration while complying with sentencing laws for juvenile offenders. During sentencing, the court highlighted the calculated nature of the crime and the importance of protecting the public from future harm. Jessica's family addressed the court, describing the permanent impact of her loss and the devastating absence left behind. The case prompted widespread reflection within the community and beyond, leading to increased discussions around child safety, neighborhood awareness, and the importance of taking reports of attempted abductions seriously. Schools reviewed walking policies, parents altered routines, and law enforcement agencies used the case as an example of why early warning signs cannot be dismissed. Jessica Ridgway's death was not the result of random chance, but the outcome of an individual who had previously tested boundaries without consequence. Austin Sigg remains incarcerated, serving a sentence that reflects both accountability and public protection. The case stands as a reminder that early intervention matters, that warning signs must be acted upon, and that the cost of inaction can be irreversible, leaving behind families and communities forever changed. Number 8. The Schuyler Neese Case. On the night of July 6, 2012, 16-year-old Schuyler Neese quietly left her home in Star City, West Virginia, climbing out of a bedroom window after receiving a late-night message from two people she trusted most, her lifelong friends Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, a decision that would become the last one she ever made and would ultimately expose a crime rooted not in impulse or fear, but in deliberate betrayal. Schuyler was described as outgoing, loyal, and deeply invested in her friendships, particularly with Eddy and Schoaf, with whom she had shared years of school, social life, and constant communication. That night, the girls told Schuyler they were going to drive around and talk, something they had done many times before, which is why no immediate alarm was raised. Surveillance footage later showed a car picking Schuyler up near her home shortly after midnight, after which she vanished completely. When Schuyler did not return, her parents reported her missing, launching an investigation that initially struggled to gain traction due to assumptions that she had run away voluntarily. A conclusion investigators would later acknowledge was incorrect and damaging to early momentum. Despite Schuyler's parents insisting that her behavior was out of character, leads stalled and weeks turned into months without answers. During this time, Eddy and Schoaf publicly participated in search efforts, posted messages online expressing concern, and remained close to Schuyler's family, all while concealing their direct involvement in her disappearance. Behind the scenes, however, the truth was already fixed. The two girls had planned Schuyler's death in advance, driven by a desire to end the friendship permanently. Their stated motive, later revealed in court, was chillingly simple. They no longer wanted to be friends with her. On the night Schuyler disappeared, the three drove across state lines into a remote area near the West Virginia and Pennsylvania border. There, Eddy and Schoaf carried out their plan, leaving Schuyler behind and returning home as if nothing had happened. For months, the investigation remained stalled, but digital evidence began to accumulate. Text messages, social media posts, and inconsistencies in the girls' statements raised suspicion among investigators. Friends of the trio noticed unsettling behavior, including cryptic posts made by Eddy that referenced violence and disappearance, which, in hindsight, pointed directly to what had occurred. Pressure mounted as law enforcement reclassified the case as a suspected homicide. In January 2013, the case broke open when Rachel Schoaf experienced a psychological crisis and confessed to authorities. Her statement led investigators to Schuyler's remains, which were recovered in a wooded area, bringing an end to months of uncertainty for Schuyler's family. The discovery confirmed that Schuyler had not run away and that her death had been planned and carried out by those she trusted most. Schoaf entered a plea agreement and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10 years due to her cooperation. Sheila Eddy, identified as the primary instigator, pleaded guilty separately and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentencing reflected both the severity of the crime and the legal considerations surrounding juvenile offenders. Throughout the proceedings, the court emphasized the calculated nature of the act, noting that this was not the result of panic or emotional loss of control, but a conscious decision made over time. Schuyler's parents delivered emotional statements, describing the unbearable reality of discovering that their daughter's closest friends were responsible for her death and the lasting trauma caused by months of deception. The case had immediate and lasting effects beyond the courtroom. Public outrage over the initial handling of Schuyler's disappearance led to legislative change in West Virginia, resulting in the passage of Schuyler's Law, which reformed Amber Alert protocols to allow alerts to be issued more quickly for missing children, even when foul play is not immediately confirmed. The law aimed to prevent future cases from being delayed by assumptions and underscored the importance of rapid response in missing child investigations. The Schuyler niece case remains one of the most unsettling examples of peer violence, not because of spectacle, but because of its motivation. There was no financial gain, no external pressure, and no immediate threat. The crime emerged from emotional detachment, resentment, and a willingness to permanently erase a person rather than confront conflict. Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf remain incarcerated, their lives defined by a decision made at 16 years old, while Schuyler Niece is remembered through advocacy, legal reform, and the warning her case continues to represent. It stands as a stark reminder that danger does not always come from strangers, that betrayal can be as destructive as any act of rage, and that early assumptions in investigations can carry irreversible consequences for families seeking answers. Number 9. The Chardon High School shooting. On the morning of February 27, 2012, Chardon High School in Northeast Ohio began like any other school day, with students gathering in the cafeteria before first period, talking, eating, and preparing for class, until that ordinary routine was abruptly destroyed by an act of targeted violence carried out by 17-year-old Thomas T.J. Lane III, a student who arrived at the school armed and intent on causing harm. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Lane entered the cafeteria carrying a .22 caliber handgun and began firing at students seated at tables, creating immediate confusion and panic as classmates attempted to flee or take cover in a space never meant for danger. 3 students were fatally injured during the attack: Daniel Parmertor, age 16, Demetrius Hewlin, age 16, and Russell King Jr., age 17. 3 others were wounded, including Nick Walsack, who survived but was left with permanent injuries that changed his life. The shooting lasted less than a minute, but its impact was permanent. As students ran from the cafeteria, Lane exited the building and was chased by assistant football coach Frank Hall, whose quick response helped prevent further harm. Lane was apprehended by police a short distance from the school without further incident. He did not resist arrest and was taken into custody within minutes, bringing an end to the immediate threat, but not the trauma left behind. Investigators quickly began reconstructing Lane's background, searching for a motive that could explain the attack. Lane had transferred to Chardon High School earlier that year and was described by peers as withdrawn and socially isolated. While some reports suggested he had experienced bullying, prosecutors later clarified that the victims were not responsible for his personal struggles and that the attack was not a spontaneous reaction to a single event. Evidence showed that Lane had access to the firearm and brought it deliberately to school, indicating planning rather than impulse. In the days following the shooting, the Chardon community entered a period of collective mourning. Vigils were held, counseling services were expanded, and schools across the region increased security. Parents questioned how a student could bring a weapon into a school environment, and students struggled to process the reality that classmates they had spoken to hours earlier were gone. The legal process moved quickly due to the severity of the crime. Lane was charged as an adult with multiple counts, including aggravated murder and attempted murder. During court appearances, his behavior drew national attention. At his sentencing hearing in March 2013, Lane wore a shirt with the word "killer" written across it and made offensive gestures toward the victims' families, prompting immediate condemnation and reinforcing the perception that he showed no remorse for his actions. The courtroom was filled with grieving relatives, survivors, and community members who had waited months for accountability. Prosecutors emphasized that the attack was intentional, targeted, and carried out in a place where students should have felt safe. The defense did not contest Lane's responsibility for the shootings, but argued against the harshest possible sentence due to his age at the time of the crime. The judge rejected any argument for leniency, citing the irreversible harm caused and the need to protect the public. Thomas Lane was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the deaths, along with additional years for the attempted murder charges. The sentence ensured that he would never be released. In 2014, Lane briefly escaped from a minimum security prison facility along with 2 other inmates, an incident that reignited public concern, but he was recaptured within hours without further violence. The escape did not alter his sentence, but it reinforced fears about the long-term management of violent offenders. For the families of the victims, the legal outcome did not bring closure, only a form of accountability. Parents described empty bedrooms, unfinished plans, and milestones their children would never reach. Survivors faced ongoing physical and psychological recovery, adapting to lives permanently altered by a single morning. Nick Walczak became an advocate for accessibility and resilience, using his experience to raise awareness about disability rights and recovery, while emphasizing that survival does not erase loss. The Chardon High School shooting also contributed to broader national discussions about school safety, early intervention, and the identification of warning signs among at-risk youth. While no single policy change can prevent every act of violence, the case highlighted the importance of threat assessment programs, mental health support, and the responsibility of institutions to take concerning behavior seriously before it escalates. Unlike cases where motives remain ambiguous, Lane's actions offered a stark reminder that isolation combined with access to weapons can produce devastating results when no effective interruption occurs. The cafeteria where students once gathered was forever changed, as was the town of Chardon, which became known nationwide for a tragedy it never asked for. Thomas T.J. Lane now remains in prison, removed permanently from society, his name associated only with the harm he caused. The Chardon shooting stands as a painful example of how quickly violence can unfold in familiar spaces and how the consequences extend far beyond the moment itself, reshaping families, schools, and entire communities for generations. Number 10. Drew Peterson. Drew Peterson was a longtime police sergeant in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburban community outside Chicago, known publicly as outspoken, confident, and unapologetically blunt, a man who appeared comfortable with attention and authority, but whose personal life would eventually unravel into one of the most complex and controversial murder cases in modern Illinois history. Peterson had been married 4 times, and while multiple divorces are not uncommon, the patterns surrounding his marriages raised alarms only after his 4th wife, Stacy Peterson, vanished without explanation in October 2007. Stacy was 23 years old, nearly 30 years younger than Peterson, and her sudden disappearance immediately drew suspicion due to her previously expressed fears that if anything happened to her, Drew Peterson would be responsible. Despite extensive searches, interviews, and media coverage, Stacy Peterson was never found. And without a body or direct evidence of a crime, prosecutors were unable to file charges. As public pressure mounted, investigators turned their attention backward to Peterson's 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, who had been found dead in a dry bathtub in March 2004. At the time, Savio's death was ruled an accidental drowning, despite visible injuries and inconsistencies that troubled some observers. The case had been closed, and Peterson moved on quickly, marrying Stacy shortly afterward. However, Stacy's disappearance forced law enforcement to re-examine Savio's death with fresh scrutiny. In 2008, Savio's body was exhumed, and a new autopsy concluded that her death was a homicide caused by drowning after a physical struggle. This reversal fundamentally changed the trajectory of the investigation. Prosecutors now believed they were looking at a pattern rather than isolated incidents. Drew Peterson became the central suspect in both cases, but legal obstacles remained significant. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no forensic evidence directly tying Peterson to Savio's death beyond circumstantial indicators. The case hinged on testimony, much of it indirect, including statements Savio and Stacy had made to friends and family expressing fear of Peterson. Under traditional rules of evidence, such statements would be excluded as hearsay. In response, Illinois passed a controversial statute known informally as Drew's Law, allowing certain hearsay statements to be admitted in murder trials when the victim is deceased or missing and the statements are deemed reliable. This legal change became pivotal. In 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Kathleen Savio. The prosecution argued that Peterson killed Savio during a dispute related to their contentious divorce, and then staged the scene to appear accidental, relying on his law enforcement experience to avoid suspicion. During the trial, jurors heard testimony from medical experts, friends of Savio, and witnesses who described Peterson as controlling and volatile in his personal relationships. They also heard recorded statements and second-hand accounts in which Savio and Stacy had allegedly expressed fear that Peterson would harm them. The defense attacked the credibility of these statements, arguing that the case was built on gossip, speculation, and public bias fueled by years of media attention. Peterson himself did not testify. Throughout the proceedings, his public persona remained defiant. He gave interviews, made jokes, and dismissed the charges, behavior that many felt undermined his credibility in the eyes of the jury. On September 6, 2012, after deliberation, the jury found Drew Peterson guilty of the murder of Kathleen Savio. The verdict marked a rare instance in which a homicide conviction was secured without a body, direct forensic proof, or eyewitness testimony, relying instead on circumstantial evidence and legally admitted hearsay. In February 2013, Peterson was sentenced to 38 years in prison, a term that effectively ensured he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. For Savio's family, the conviction represented long-delayed accountability. For Stacy Peterson's family, it provided validation but not closure, as her whereabouts remain unknown to this day. The case did not end there. In 2016, Peterson was convicted in a separate case for attempting to arrange the murder of the prosecutor who had led the case against him, using intermediaries while incarcerated. He was sentenced to an additional 40 years, further cementing his permanent removal from society. Drew Peterson's story stands out not because of dramatic violence captured on video or immediate evidence, but because it illustrates how patterns can reveal truth when individual incidents appear inconclusive. It exposed how authority and familiarity can delay scrutiny, how assumptions can shield misconduct, and how persistence can eventually overcome legal barriers. The case also sparked national debate about the use of hearsay in criminal trials, balancing the rights of the accused against the reality that some crimes are specifically designed to leave no witnesses. Today, Drew Peterson remains in prison, his name synonymous with suspicion, manipulation, and unanswered questions. Kathleen Savio's death is officially recognized as a homicide, and Stacy Peterson's disappearance continues to be investigated, her absence a constant reminder of what has not been resolved. The case endures as a cautionary example of how control within private relationships can escalate unseen, how missing voices still matter in court, and how justice, even when delayed, can still arrive through persistence and structural change rather than a single piece of evidence.